Good evening and welcome. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Students, faculty, and staff are now working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. My name is Bruce Campbell. I teach in the Latino Latin American Studies program here, and I am delighted to introduce our speaker tonight. Tonight's event is possible due to the generous support of the Latino Latin American Studies program, the Sociology Department, the Political Science Department, and the Multicultural Center. A big thank you to our co-sponsors and to all of you for coming together to hear about important cultural work underway in Minnesota. Our speaker this evening, Aaron Johnson-Ortiz, will be sharing with us some of his work and perspective as a mural artist, cultural organizer, and arts administrator. Aaron, or Aaron, is a Mexican, Latino, and Mexican-American cultural organizer, arts advocate, and award-winning muralist based in Minnesota. His art focuses on workers' rights, immigrant rights, Latino culture, and Mexican identity. His mural, Workers United in Struggle, was named the 2018 Best Mural in the Twin Cities by City Pages. Aaron is the founder and executive director of Neomuralismos de Mexico, a Latino public arts and cultural organization based in the Twin Cities that operates transnationally in connecting artists and communities in Minnesota and Mexico. He is a co-founder of the Mexican Cultural Arts Alliance, a collaborative network of Mexican arts and culture organizations located across the U.S. and in Mexico. Aaron is also the founder of the Minnesota Latino Museum, a new initiative to build a museum space and public programming to support and expand the visibility of Latino arts and culture in the state of Minnesota. Please join me in a warm welcome for Aaron Johnson-Ortiz.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches, ¿cómo están? Bien. Okay, who speaks only English? Okay, solamente español, ¿quién habla? Okay, vamos a hacerlo en Spanglish entonces. We're going to do a little bit of Spanglish here. A little Mexi-sotans today. A ver. Sí, buenas tardes. So thank you, Bruce, for inviting me, and thanks to the college as well. We're going to start off with a little bit of history about Mexican and Latino art in Minnesota. And this is a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm just going to do some highlights of some artists that I like that many people don't know, and some that people do know. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about our organizational work, un poquito del trabajo de nuestra organización de arte. And then I want to talk a little bit about demographics in Minnesota, as well as the US at large, and kind of the direction that we're going as a state and a country. And lastly, we'll talk about the Minnesota Latino Museum, que es el museo que vamos a empezar aquí en Minnesota para la comunidad mexicana y latina de Minnesota. So we're starting a new museum project that I'm very excited about for Mexican and Latino immigrants, and second and third and fourth generation people as well. So one of the things that happens often when we talk about Mexicans and Latinos in the upper Midwest is that most people think, including many people in our community, that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? That this has happened in the 1990s. Mucha gente de la comunidad piensa que los primeros latinos que llegaron fueron en los 80s, 90s, y sí fueron en los 80s, 90s, but in the 1890s and 1990s, the first folks. So this is Luis Garzón, and I always like to say the very first person who immigrated to Minnesota from Latin America was an artist. He was in an orchestra. He played the oboe and the flute. Era de Oaxaca, Oaxaqueño. He was in a touring orchestra, and when they came to Minnesota, he got sick, and the orchestra moved on. He stayed in the hospital, and then he fell in love and stayed in Minnesota, and his children and great-grandchildren are still in our state. Luis Garzón, de oaxaqueño, músico, llegó en el 1866, and he stayed here until 1954. Unfortunately, I don't have any work samples from Luis Garzón. For those of you who are historians, I would love to embark on a research project to try to find some kind of record of Luis's work. But we do have the work of the amazing rock and roll Mexican-American, St. Paul born artist, Augie Garcia, born on the West Side Flats of St. Paul in 1932. And he's known as the godfather of rock and roll in Minnesota. This is an article published a couple years ago by Vicky Adame, who did a lot of great stories about Mexicans and Latinos in our state for NPR. And she did a story about the history of the West Side Flats, and specifically the history of trauma of communities being displaced, particularly Mexicans who were displaced from the West Side Flats, but also the wonderful culture that they share. So Augie was part of her article. Si conocen dónde está? Do you guys know where the West Side Flats are? People have been to, it's across the river from downtown St. Paul. It's the kind of the lower region of what's known as the west side of St. Paul. It's very confusing because it's actually south of downtown, slightly southeast actually. But of course the reason it's known as the west side is because it's the west side of the river. And in the United States, historically at least, everything to the east of the river is known as kind of like the eastern half of the country, and everything to the west of the Mississippi River is known as the west. So this is the west side of Minnesota. It was also a working class neighborhood. In the first part of the century, it quickly became a Mexican neighborhood. It was the first Mexicano barrio in Minnesota. And of course people moved there because it was cheap to live. On a semi-regular basis, there was flooding from the river, and so nobody who had any means or resources wanted to live on what is was called the West Side Flats. And of course, Augie is from this neighborhood. Today, decades and actually a century later, Distrito del Sol, some people call it, people on the west side don't like that term for the most part, but it's the only Latino-focused and Latino-centered district in the state of Minnesota. And so of course there are all kinds of neighborhoods, Lake Street in Minneapolis, places like Worthington, Austin, Wilmar, where there's very strong Latino populations, but the west side continues to be the only officially recognized Latino district in Minnesota. WESCO is the West Side Community Organization, and they've embarked on a very important organizing campaign over the past couple years to recognize the original Mexican immigrants who came and settled, and many of whom were born as well on the west side, who were displaced in the 1950s and 1960s. So the city of St. Paul in the late 50s decided that it was unlivable, and so now a lot of people know Cesar Chavez Avenue, El Burrito, all that was Mexican immigrants who had previously lived in the flats who were displaced up onto the higher terrain. And this is an interview with one of the original residents of the flats. Rachel Rankin is another person who was interviewed for this project. A lot of folks on the flats were told that they had to leave. They weren't given a choice. Sometimes they were given compensation, but it was very minimal. And to this day, the Mexican barrio has not been fully compensated for the property that was taken from the neighborhood, from the people there. Larry, who's taking photos in the background, and ahí está. I always say Larry is one of the best photographers in Minnesota. And correct me if I'm wrong, Larry, you're third or fourth generation Mexican from the west side. So I had the privilege of walking with his father, Larry Lucio Sr., about 2 weeks ago. And he gave us a tour of where he lived on the West Side Flats. It was right kitty corner from the city dump. It was a working class neighborhood, but he always says that it was a wonderful upbringing. He carries a lot of trauma over the forced displacement of the community. This is an interview from NPR from earlier this year with Larry Lucio about the displacement of folks from the West Side Flats. So I just want to give a little bit of a taste. Uh-oh. Sorry. I think I'm just going to have to search this. One of the stories that's told about Ayi Garcia is that he was a bit crazy. A lot of rock and roll artists were that way. They would perform, they would jump out on the stage, they would jump around. When Elvis Presley came to town, Ayi was the opening act for Elvis Presley. And the story goes, this is oral history, that the opening act was so good, the crowd was going so crazy that they had to yank Ayi off the stage because they were worried that he would upstage Elvis Presley. All right, let's continue with this. Oh, in the bottom left corner, there was other music that he played. So there was kind of more bolero style music that different band. Who here knows who Lila Downs is? Keep your hands up. Who knows she's from Minnesota? All right. So this is not something that's very well known. Lila Downs is considered by, I think, most people who study music to be one of the most, if not the most important contemporary Mexican musician, at least for the past 50 years or so. And a lot of people know about her mother, who was from Oaxaca and who was a singer as well. A lot of people don't know that Downs is not a typically Mexican last name, and it comes from her father, Alan Downs, who was a Scottish-American filmmaker who taught at the University of Minnesota. And so Lila talks a lot about her upbringing, growing up between Minnesota and different parts of Mexico. I know that she also went to college at the University of Minnesota. I think she dropped out before finishing and then went on to become international award-winning, Grammy-winning musician. But she, in this interview from 2010 with CNN, she talks about growing up in Oaxaca, growing up in Minneapolis, and the cultural differences between her parents and how confusing it was for her and her identity, but also in trying to explain to other people that she's Mexicana, also from Minnesota, also from Oaxaca, also from Mexico. And she's also Mixtec from her mother's side. these links aren't working. So this is a little bit much more recent, and I thought it would be interesting in an academic setting, especially because Alan Downs led a study abroad program in Mexico, and this is how Lila Downs came to be. Unfortunately, we're having issues with the internet here. Oh, yeah. Well, we might have to skip that. Well, one thing I do want to share is that's a family photo of Lila Downs when she was a kid with her mom, Anita Downs, and her father was a filmmaker. Her mom was a singer, her father a filmmaker, Alan Downs. Luis Pitch. Who knows Luis Pitch? ¿Quién lo conoce? Heard of him? Okay. Luis is born in Tijuana, and he's been living and working in Minneapolis for a while. And a couple of things that he's done that are very noteworthy is he recently designed the U.S. post stamps for Day of the Dead. It's the first post stamp in the country recognizing Day of the Dead. And Luis Pitch was also on the state commission last year and this year to redesign the Minnesota state flag. So the Minnesota state flag originally was kind of this blue flag with a yellow circle in the middle, and it has an image that especially many Dakota people found to be offensive. It's a white European farmer, kind of on the left, and then to the right, heading into the sunset, there's a native person, or a person that's sort of represented as a native person. And a lot of folks interpreted this as Europeans coming into Minnesota and natives kind of going into the past. And so, of course, we have a lieutenant governor who's Peggy Flanagan, who's native, indigenous, and if Tim Walz becomes president, she'll be the first indigenous governor in the country. And so, under the current administration, they went through a process of redesigning the state flag. And so you can see up here, this is in the space station, the new state flag, along with the University of Minnesota flag, was flown. And it was a process that took several months, but there was sort of three elements to the flag. One is just the concept of water. Luis talks a lot about how the Mississippi River influenced his decision as chairperson to kind of really push the concept of water onto the flag. And of course we have 10,000 lakes. Minnesota is known for just an abundance of water. And from his perspective, if you turn the flag, sort of let it drop, the lighter blue looks like a river going into the distance, and the North Star is sort of the guiding light. And so he talks about being a Mexican immigrant to Minnesota and having the state flag symbolize this sort of guiding path, which is the Mississippi River heading north. You should look at some of these videos. It has interviews with him, but I guess we're not going to do that today. I want to talk about my own work a little bit, where kind of my background and how I got into this work with the museum and with public art, with exhibits. I grew up in Minnesota. I also grew up in Guatemala City and in Chiapas, Mexico. I went back and forth as a kid, and when I went to school, I always wanted to be an artist. I've always wanted to be an artist since I was a little kid. I did my bachelor's degree here and my master's in fine arts at the University of Michigan. And I just decided that I didn't like the art world because it was just very disconnected from things I cared about. And so for a period of about 5 years after I did my MFA, I did community organizing, union organizing in Illinois. And then in 2015, my brother passed away. He was also a Mexi-sotan, Benedict, Johnson-Ortiz. And I decided to come back to Minnesota and sort of re-pursue my art career, but to look at it from a grassroots organizing perspective. And so the first things that I did were work with different community organizing and union organizing campaigns in Minnesota. I started working with Setur, which is a worker center in South Minneapolis. And this is one of the posters I designed for them. This was during, they had a victory campaign for unionizing janitorial staff across sectors in the Twin Cities. Hello. Wow. Okay, all right, this is fun. At least the projector is still working.
No, my fault. I leaned against the panel.
And then this is part of this is a collaboration between Setul and Heart of the Beast for the May Day Parade. So I did a couple banners for them, and then I also did a mural on the outside of their building. This is one of the scenes. So this is kind of the central area of the mural. And it's really just a story about the workers themselves, the community leaders who led fast food campaigns, janitorial staff campaigns, and construction worker campaigns for better wages, healthcare, etc. In 2019, I was hired to start the Arts and Cultural Engagement Program at PLUS, which is Comunidad Latina Unidas en Servicio. And so I started the first, or not the first, at that time the only Latino-focused art gallery in the state. I also worked for a while doing apprenticeship program with Latino muralists. So this is a mosaic project that was done collectively, but led by two different mosaic artists. This is what the mosaic looked like in the end. This is of course during the pandemic, so everybody's wearing their masks. This is Flor Soto, who was going to come up a couple of times in some other slides, but she's an artist based in Austin, Minnesota. She worked for a long time at the Hormel plant. For those of you who know, Hormel does a lot of meat packing, primarily pork products. And while she was working there, she's from Mazatlan, Sinaloa. While she was working there, a piece of equipment, heavy equipment, fell on her hand and it damaged her hand. And so she had to stop working. She got workers' compensation, and as part of the workers' compensation policy, you're not allowed to work at the same time. You can't take on employment while receiving workers' comp. So she started making piñatas because she couldn't keep still. She's a very kind of busy person. And so even though she had sort of a damaged hand, she created this Frida image. She did a muñeca. She did the flowers for the rainbow. And so we exhibited this work in 2020. This is our muralism project that was exhibited in 2021. We also did a lot of work on Lake Street in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, the social unrest, a lot of conflict, a lot of tension in the community. And so we decided to use our culture to talk about healing and to bring people together to make art together, make culture together, and also create spaces for people to have conversations. These are some of the projects that we did in 2021 on Lake Street. This was we did a parade, well, procession really, for Day of the Dead. These were 4 Catrinas that were made by Peruvian artist Gustavo Boada, who's a master paper mache and artist and puppeteer. At that time, I was also kind of feeling lonely myself. I know a lot of people went through periods of anxiety, loneliness, depression And so, and we also had to do everything online during that time. So we decided what better time than now to meet other people around the country who are doing similar work. And so we started a new organization. It's called the Mexican Culture Arts Alliance. We're the only national, and actually now it's a binational alliance of Mexican-led culture organizations, arts and culture organizations, including the National Museum of Mexican Art. It's Carlos Toledo, who's the founder, on the right, or your left, my right. And then several states, Georgia, Indiana, obviously Minnesota, Illinois, Utah, Colorado, and California are represented in the alliance. And then we added, of course, San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas as well. So this has been very helpful for me as somebody who, you go into arts administration, there's not really a lot of training, especially for the kind of work that I do. There are very few Latino museums in the US, we'll get to that in a second. So there's no academic program really that you can go into to learn about it, how to do it. So having this space for me has been very helpful. These are some of the folks who have been part of the Mexican Culture Arts Alliance. It's funny, Guadalupe Blauer, who's executive director in Utah of our peer organization in Utah, and Fernando Ramirez, who's based in West Chicago. And we're at the Museo Anahuacalli in Mexico City, which is Diego Rivera's wonderful created museum. And then the other photo is two artists from Chiapas, Anshel and Anton, and one artist from Minnesota, that's Gustavo Boala, he's the puppeteer I mentioned. And we were in Guadalajara. This is a mural by Orozco, Orozco in Guadalajara. In 2022, I decided that I really wanted to start an independent arts nonprofit. I enjoyed my time at Clues, but it's just not conducive. A social service organization is not conducive to all the things that you want to do for the arts, with artists, as an artist. And so we started a new organization, which Bruce mentioned, Neomuralismos de Mexico. At that time, I named it that because 2021 was the centennial of the Mexican muralist movement. I myself am a muralist, and I wanted to kind of promote Mexican muralism in Minnesota and around the country. We've been doing several outreach projects over the past 2 years. This is in Red Wing in 2022. Raquel Caprosi, who's a master weaver from Guatemala. She does wonderful work. I'll talk more about backstrap loom weaving in a second. And the other activity is paper flower making with tissue paper. We've been to Worthington, Minnesota. Worthington is in the southwest of the state, and it's the city with the highest Latino population and Mexican population, percentage-wise, in the state. Austin, Minnesota, again with the amazing Flor Soto. This was a mural that we did that she led, but I mentored. It was her first mural, it was her first real painting exercise, and it's actually, the mural's quite a bit longer, but this is the centerpiece. It's a giant sun, and at the mural unveiling in 2023, in September, the mayor of Austin, Minnesota called it the most beautiful mural I've ever seen in my life. So we were very happy with that, and of course, Bud is a local famous person in Austin, Minnesota. I mentioned Anton Vasquez earlier. We did originally a residency with him in Guadalajara, and then we got a visa for him to come to Minnesota. He was in Duluth, he was in Red Wing, he was in St. Paul, he was in Minneapolis. We did a whole tour of him around the state last year, and then he came back earlier this year and kind of repeated his residency. He's a Maya Tzotzil artist from the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico. These are some of Gustavo Boala's puppets, and in this case they're giant alebrijes. I'll talk a little bit about what alebrijes are for those who don't know, but he puts them on bikes, which is kind of his invention, And so this bici alebrijes, the bike alebrijes, go in parades, festivals, all over the state. And so this is, of course, an event that we did in Minneapolis last year, but they've been to Worthington, they've been to Austin, they've been to Red Wing, they've been to Duluth, they've been all over the state, toured over the past 2 years. There's Gustavo in Northfield. And then, of course, on top of Gustavo, he's been teaching workshops with community participants. So Jose and Josefa had never worked with paper mache before, but Jose made that Quetzalcoatl, bici alebrije on the right side there. And that was kind of his first puppet that he made. More activities in St. Paul, Minnesota. We brought Edgar Camargo from Mexico City, who's a master paper mache and alebrije creator, to Minnesota earlier this year. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this project just because it's historically important. In 2022, my sister and I decided that we wanted to ask the Minnesota Council of Latino Affairs. MCLA is the state agency that connects the Latino community of Minnesota with the state government, if we could use the state capitol grounds to create a Day of the Dead altar. And as far as we knew, it had never been done. And we selected 2 artists, Monica Vega and Flor Soto, to create the altar. And we were lucky that the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general came and toured the altar. It was covered quite a bit by the media, television, NPR, and Governor Walz issued a state proclamation recognizing the altar, recognizing our work, our organization, but also, most importantly, recognizing Day of the Dead in Minnesota for the first time. We didn't know this at the time. We found out about it later. But according to the governor's staff, and I've double-checked this, I couldn't find anything that would contradict this claim. Through this state proclamation, Minnesota became the first state in the United States to officially recognize Day of the Dead. It's one of the most important traditions in the country, on the continent. It's sad that it's taken this long, but we're very proud in Minnesota to lead the way, honestly, at a national level. Sometimes I look at data. Minnesota has about 350 to 400,000 Latinos. Mexicans specifically are around 230,000. We're a rounding error if you compare us to Texas or California. Right? In Texas, I think it's like 12 million, I guess 8 millions, and then if you add on 200,000 or take off 200,000, it's like it doesn't make a difference. But somehow we've managed to do things that no other state has been able to do here in our home state. So I just want to talk a little bit about some data points because I do think it's important to understand the cultural impact of Mexican and Latino. And I always say Mexican and Latino. We can talk about why I use that phrasing the Q&A section if you'd like. But again, part of the reason why people have the perception that Latinos came to Minnesota in the 1990s is because numerically it makes sense, right? But we've been here since the 1930s, since the 1800s. And there's many families who have been around for decades, if not over a century, in our home state. And so it's always important for me to educate people about that history, because even within our own community, people don't know how long we've been here and how long we've had an impact on this state. But some data points, about 2/3 of Latinos in Minnesota are Mexican, 67%. Nationally, it's closer to 60%. So it's a little bit more in Minnesota than nationally, but pretty close. 10% of Minnesota children are Latino, so we're heading in that direction. People don't know this, but this was posted at the Star Tribune, I think 2-3 weeks ago. We shared it on our Instagram page, and everybody's like, "What? How is this possible? It doesn't make sense. It's not true." Blah blah. Mexicans are the largest non-white group in Minnesota. It's also true nationally. People always find this shocking for some reason. There are some issues with the census that, there's some unreliability on the census, and we can talk about that maybe again in the Q&A section. But nevertheless, the official numbers from the U.S. Census for Minnesota and for the United States are that Mexicans are the largest sort of non-European group in the country and the state. This is an article from Star Tribune from last year, same census data, but a different article. A lot of people think that we're only in urban areas, and of course, the bulk of the Mexican and Latino populations are in the Twin Cities. But percentage-wise, on a per capita basis, there are places around the state that have greater numbers of Mexican and Latino residents. If you can see up in the northwest section, that's Crookston, Minnesota. Crookston is historically a region where braceros came to work beet farms, sugar beets. And so again, there's recent Mexican immigrants in Crookston, but there's also folks who have been there for 2, 3, 4 generations. Many don't speak Spanish anymore, but still carry on traditions. In the southwest of the state, there's Worthington, Mankato, and then the southeast, Austin, Minnesota, Albert Lee are areas of the state that have very high Mexican and Central American and Latino populations. This is basically the same number. We keep growing. If you don't know that already, you should. Again, I like to point out these data points because one of the things that happens in almost every conversation I have about creating spaces for Latino people and for Mexican people is that whenever I talk about having a Mexican cultural center or a Mexican museum or a Mexican art exhibit, I always get the same effing response, which is, why is it always going to be Mexicans? And the truth is, this is the actual truth, Mexicans have some of the lowest levels of cultural representation of any community of color, never mention white folks, in the country and in the state. And so for me, it's very important to point out this data because the numbers just are not lying about how many of us are here and how many of us do not have access to arts activities, exhibits, music, political representation, economic representation, media representation, and here we are, 10.7 million. This is just immigrantes. It doesn't include Mexicans of second and third and fourth generation. We're around 40 million in the United States, and a quarter, or about a quarter, are immigrants. Another important fact is that in the United States, Mexicans account for about a quarter of all Mexicans worldwide. So in Mexico, there's 75% of Mexicans. In the United States, it's about 24%. And then there's like 1% living in Canada and the rest of the world. So the United States is very much a part of Mexico. Es verdad. There's the numbers. This is the census data. Okay. These are the states with the highest numbers of Latino populations by state, and in the great majority of the country, Mexicans represent the majority, and in many cases, super majority of populations. All right, then we go on to, okay, we have the numbers, we know we're here, we know we have culture, we know we have art, we know we have beauty, right? We know we've been, even in Minnesota, everybody says, oh, Mexicans are in the Southwest. Even in Minnesota, Mexicans have been doing art and culture since 1886, okay? This is a reality of cultural representation in the United States. The official estimate from the federal government is that there's 35,000 museums in the United States. 35,000. We estimate that maybe there's about 20 or 30 Latino museums. Maybe there's 5 to 10 Mexican-focused museums in the United States. Sometimes people talk about disparities, right? There's that thing about women earn 82 cents on the dollar. And then, of course, women of color earn 50, 60, depending on the demographic, compared to white men. If we put this on a dollar basis, we would be talking about not 1 penny on a dollar. It would be like 1/10 of a penny of a dollar in terms of our cultural representation in the United States. And in spite of all that, there's kind of a circular problem, which is that not only are we don't have the demographic representation in positions of leadership in the United States or in Minnesota, but we're not part of the conversation about equity. Latinos are about 40% of people of color in the United States. And this is conversation about articles about equity over a 2-3 year period. It's from the University or the Berkeley Media Studies, Berkeley, California. And they found that about 5.6% of articles about equity specifically mention Latinos. My guess is if they had done that study with Mexicans specifically, it would be close to 0. Like we're talking less than 1%. Even though Mexicans in the United States are about 10-11% of the population. Okay, we're solving the problem. We're gonna get this done. You know, one of the things is for me, it's I get excited every day. I wake up in the morning every day, and yes, there's a lot of disparities. The disparities are not small. They're not percentage-wise, or in many ways orders of magnitude. But for me, that means there's also great opportunity. Right? There's enormous opportunity for growth. And so, Bruce is part of our board of directors. So on behalf of our organization, we are leading the effort in Minnesota to open the first museum in our state dedicated to the oldest immigrant community of color, Latinos, 2/3 of which are Mexicanos, in the West Side Flats neighborhood, which is adjacent to the first Latino barrio in our state, and close to Cesar Chavez, or about a mile away from the only Latino cultural district in the state. So let me show you the location. Oh, never mind. Let me show you Bruce. Here's Bruce. So yeah, this was this last year?
This was last year.
Oh, Jesus Christ. So I gathered the board of directors together, right? We started our nonprofit in 2022. We barely got 501c3 status in 2023. And I think 2 months after we got 501c3 status, we were just adding new directors. I think Bruce, we had just started. And you all know Maria Isa Perez-Vega? Yeah. Okay. It's Boricua, wonderful rapper, singer, also amazing Mexican Latina artist in Minnesota. And she ran for office in 2022. And one of her campaign goals was to, in her webpage, said, we want to open the first Latino museum in Minnesota. We met with her when she was still in campaign mode. I asked her, where is this museum? What's the idea? Who's leading it? And so anyways, over time, she got elected. She tried to, the first time to pass the bill in 2023. Failed the first time. You got to do it a couple of times to get through. And so last year we decided that we were going to adopt this project through our organization in coordination with the community. Certainly this was part of her campaign platform, but the effort to create a museum in Minnesota goes back decades. Several people in my family, friends, artists that I know. I've been doing this work for in a professional capacity for over 10 years. In terms of my own personal life, for 30 years. And for me, when I talk with Latino artists in Minnesota, the #1 request is always, why don't we have a cultural center? Why don't we have a museum? Why can't we have a space that represents our community, our values, our art forms, our traditions? And so, yes, Maria Isa was really the catalyst to make it happen in her campaign, but it is a request that goes back decades, and that's been around and part of the bloodstream of our community for a long time. Myself, we tried to do this project on Lake Street in 2020, and 2021, 2022, and we were unsuccessful. I can talk later about why we were unsuccessful, but at that point I understood the difficulty of trying to get the political and community support for making this happen. And so when we met with Representative Perez-Vega, we were like, well, we're ready to make this happen, but we need the political support to do this. I was going to show you a clip of Mariesa's music, but you should look that up later. Harriet Island Regional Park is on the Mississippi River. This right here is the only Mexican-American Veterans Memorial in the state. It is not exactly where the Mexican barrio was, but about, I would say, 3 or 4 blocks to the west of where it was. But there was always cultural activities in this park. Just for you to get a sense. Let's see. Derek, can you help me with this? The barrio was here or here?
Closer to the highway.
Yeah, so it was this area, right?
Yeah, almost off that map.
Yeah, so Larry's dad and family were neighborhood. So this down here is what is now Cesar Chavez and Burritos right here. This is the downtown culture district. Harriet Island is the only location in our capital city that is simultaneously part of the west side and part of the downtown culture district. And that's so blurry. Oh no. Can you help Bruce? Text stuff. Well, I'll just keep talking. The Mississippi River, in addition to being the location of the first Mexican barrio in the state, has a much older connection to what's known now as Mexico and Latin America. So, do you all know where corn started? ¿Dónde empezó el maíz? México. See? So somewhere between Jalisco and Oaxaca is where corn was domesticated to the best. This was like 10,000 years ago, so it's not totally clear. But over a period of millennia, corn, squash, beans made their way across the continent. And in the upper Midwest, corn arrived between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. How? Through the river, of course. So the river has always been our connection, right, across the continent. Before there was highways, before there was airplanes, there was commerce on the river. And so the impact of Mexico and Central America, Mesoamerica at the time, in the upper Midwest is very much connected to the Mississippi River. So for me, it was always important that we were recognizing the importance of the river, not just in terms of Mexican and Latino migration history to Minnesota, but in terms of the cultural impact of corn, beans, squash over 1,000 years ago to the region that is now Minnesota. I think it's just a really large file. All right, I'm gonna technology. Okay, let's just jump to the renderings. So this was done earlier this year. Of course, this is just a concept. Undoubtedly, ay, Dios mío. Maybe it. Is it going to jump back if we just...
You may need to change the number of the slide.
Okay. Okay. Well, this is fun. All right. Todo bien, todo bien. Just adding some excitement here. Can you fix it? It's like a thriller. It's going to happen. So, anyways, esto lo hizo un grupo de arquitectos, architecture firm based in St. Paul, Black and Latino-led Formula, the company's called Formula. And again, this is a conceptual design. It is not the final design. We don't know what the final design is like, but it's helpful to have these sort of concept designs to react to. This is the front. This is kind of, for me, what was kind of important to think about. It's the piece of land is sort of this long stretch of green space. And so, and it's part of the park system. So for me, it was important to have a sculpture park. This is the kind of the museum building where we can talk about arts, culture, history, Minnesota history. And I mentioned corn, right? So it's very important for us to tell our story through agriculture, through cempasúchil flowers, through maize, through frijoles, so on and so forth. And also, Minnesota is very hard in the winter, and so we wanted to create a green space for our community to be able to come to and be surrounded by plants. We have the support of Mayor Carter in St. Paul, as well as the Port Authority and Mexi-sotans and Latino Affairs, Chicano Latino Studies at the University of Minnesota, and so on and so forth. This is the timeline as it stands right now. And ya para que no se duerman, we'll end it here. We'll do some Q&A. We do have an online petition. If you want to take out your phones to the QR code, if you want to sign the petition for the Minnesota Latino Museum, I would very much appreciate it. Y ahí la dejamos y vamos a platicar un poco. How do we do this, Brandon? Just respond to people? You have a question back there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm possibly concerned about the location. Isn't that an area where there could be flooding?
That's a great point. So there is left back there. So a couple things. I forgot to see, this is what happens. I was distracted by technology. I forgot to tell the story about why people are doing a campaign right now to get reparations for the Mexicans who were displaced from the West Side Flats. There has not been a flood on the flats since Mexicans were displaced. And the reason is that immediately after the community was kicked out, forcibly kicked out, in many cases they came in with bulldozers, told people to leave, they put in a levee. And so there's now been a levee for the past 60 years, and the water has never been close to coming over. And so the past decade or so, there's been quite a bit of construction on the other side of the levee. So we're on the other side of the levee.
Right.
There's not really a concern of flooding. And there's other ways of dealing with it. So you can do like parking on the first level and put the majority of the the collections, et cetera, above where any water would get to. So there's ways of mitigating the problem. And then lastly, the concept of museum has changed quite a bit in the past 10, 20 years. The American Alliance of Museums, the Institute for Museum and Library Studies, our services, no longer considers a collection to be necessary for a museum. It's strange because then the question becomes, well, what is a museum? We can have that debate. The point is, we can have a community space, a museum, a cultural center that might look different than what has historically been called a museum. And certainly, this is part of the process that we have to go through for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years as we develop our project. ¿Quién más? Hi.
Hello. Hello. Bringing up the topic that you just said about like collections.
Yeah.
How are you guys collecting? Like, how are you deciding who to feature as artists for the museum? And like, a lot of times museums feature people that have already passed or that are long ago. So how do you plan on like integrating like newer artists from younger generations and stuff like that?
That's a great question. So we don't have a museum yet. We haven't crossed that bridge yet. We do feature local artists and national and international artists. We do exhibits, we do public art. activities, we do community-based art. Certainly, it is my intention that we focus primarily on living artists. I think that that has to be the case. We don't have a substantial collection. There are museums that are generally what you might call a collector's museum, where somebody who is relatively wealthy starts collecting specific artists, then they pass away, and then the family's like, what do we do with all this art, right? And then that is sometimes donated to a museum, or sometimes a small museum kind of emerges from the collection, right? So that's one way of making a museum. It's not what we're doing. We're doing it from the ground up. So we have to build as we go. The good news is that most of the people who are involved with creating the museum were all working artists. So I'm not particularly concerned about, at this stage anyway, that we'll have a sufficient collection. It won't be enormous. We work very closely with the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago. Carlos Toledo started it 40 years ago. And of course, I've asked him these questions like, how big was your collection when you started? It was non-existent. There was no such thing. Now they have to turn away donations because they have so many items in their collection. So I'm not concerned about that in the long run. In the short run, there is of course a question of like, where's your art? And the answer is, we have some in our studio, we're making some of it, and in 5 to 10 years we'll have a opening of a museum with some art. Yeah.
Well, how does somebody come to our area to teach the art? Because I think because we have so many here, why can't we learn, our students learn that, those valuable tools?
You're talking about teaching a class at the university, or?
Well, not just the university. I'm talking about like this age. I'm talking high school and junior high and younger, so that we can start to grow that interest and make it more alive.
Yeah.
We
Well,
have
it was-
nothing that's like this that is taught in our community
Yeah.
to our kids and our younger generation. I'm a second generation here,
Yeah.
and I try to, to keep my culture alive with them, and teach them everything that I grew up with my parents doing. But then some of the stuff there's always a barrier because they take them away from us.
Yeah.
And then, so that's when we go back and say, how do I keep these alive without them kind of like shutting my kids down and not teaching them or taking things from them that should be taught because it's part of their future. It's part of, that's what we have, and that's what we teach our kids, to be more cultural like we grew up,
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in California.
Okay.
I am from El Salvador.
Oh, okay.
I was born there, but raised here, so I came when I was little. And my whole life, I lived in California until 22 years old. Then moved here.
Been here for 22 years?
Yes, in Minnesota.
Yeah, great.
In Minnesota. And but like I said, it took a long time for us to find something for our kids to stay with our language and all that until they brought us Spanish immersion to St. Cloud.
Yeah.
That's when I right away I put my kids in there and enrolled them in there because I want them to grow up speaking Spanish.
Yeah.
I want them to grow up knowing my culture, where I came from, and and I grew up between Mexicans and Salvadorian, because I grew up in poverty, like a lot of people, would think, but to us, it wasn't poverty, it was, that's what we have, this is what we're gonna work with, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. There's now a Salvadorian consulate in St. Paul. Copal is, of course, it's Latino, but it's largely Salvadorian led. So the good news is that there is increasing organizations. For me, I always say two things. One is there's a huge deficit and there's a huge opportunity, right? The fact that there is none means that we get to create it together, and we get to do this for our kids and grandkids. So yeah, so everywhere we go, we do activities all over the state, but I can tell you when we go to Worthington, it's like some mayoría Latinos in Worthington. When I've been there, they were like, we've never had a Latino focused festival. It's like 50% of the population. Like, how can you not have like a? So yeah, so it's a challenge, but it does mean that we get to do it and we get to lead it ourselves. So you're doing great work. ¿Qué pasa?
And I want to say that it's something of my dreams. But you know, with all the work that we have been doing, like first the more emergency, like the urgency that we gotta do is like healthcare, immigration, driver license and all that. But it's like a seed that is in my heart that one day we can have something for the kids and youth, do not lose the culture, do not lose the, I born in Mexico,
Michoacán.
And I grew up, I went to the schools there, like La Primaria, La Secundaria. So I remember over there they teach a lot of culture, like Día de las Madres, Día de los Muertos, todo se festeja allá, y todo es con cultura. So it's why I was thinking like we have a great opportunity here in Central Minnesota, but it is like step by step.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. I'm sure it's. I'm not the only one in the room, but I'm always like, people are like, why'd you do this? And I'm like, trabajo como 80 horas a la semana. It's like, paciencia. But yes, we're going to get there. And for me, this is always the question about the museum, right? This is not my museum. This is something that we have to build together. And the truth is that unless we get people involved, we get community support from many different communities, organizations, it's not going to happen. La verdad. So we appreciate the desire y el esfuerzo.
Yeah, because I see that this will be entertaining the kids and they can talk when they are doing something and they can express all what they feel in the art. I just feel that because I feel like the inside, when we do a final, we are thinking like, oh, what happened in those days? And myself, because I like to dance. I don't know how to do that, but I try to do that. And those things are the things I want to show to my kids or to my grandkids.
That's what we're doing. ¿Qué más?
I just wanted to, not maybe a question, but like I think this is like such a great project because there's so much, the country we call about is we have a lot of negative discourses circulating about immigrants and Mexicans in particular. And so I think that art and this museum and all the initiatives that we're doing with like a collective of people really offers a powerful counter narrative to all this like stuff that circulates that is very flattening and very like negative. And so I think it's like art is yes for the kids to live their culture, but also to I think it's political too. It's a way of like showing the world that there's beauty in the culture, and it's like a space that can just give people that want to, just offer another story.
I'm curious who in this room was familiar with the story of the Mexicanos that were displaced on the West Side Flats? Unos cinco? Yeah, yo soy mexicano de St. Paul. I didn't hear about this story when I was growing up. I didn't learn about it at school. I didn't learn about it in college. I learned about it in the past like 3 years, right? So there's a lot of stories that we need to tell. And it's not just the West Side. When we go to Worthington, of course, there's a history of intense trauma, especially from the kids that were left sin padres because the parents were kidnapped by ICE. And so there's a lot of stories that we need to tell. And we do believe that arts is about two things. One is healing. It's very healing to be able to come together and make crafts and arts together. And secondly, it's about power. Because if we're able to say we have humanity, that counters, like you're saying, the narrative that keeps getting more and more negative, particularly at a national level, from both Republicans and Democrats now. See, hi.
Hi. First of all, I want to say I think the work you're doing is great, and oftentimes I hear of like Minnesota as like the holy grail of what we should be doing in terms of like policy that would be more inclusive, and I think like the work you do just contributes to that. So I just thought it was amazing. But also, my question is like Minnesota has this deep history of like environmental injustice. And like I use that word as like a big umbrella term, but like the truth is that like the state like historically organized to exclude people and to shove them into areas of like they call them Lulus. It's just like locally unwanted land use. And so I'm curious to know if like your organization has worked or is working with environmental justice groups or like local groups who have tried to work to not only like create like more green space within like historically like organized like neighborhoods, or like especially with this construction project, if they like said anything or like wanted to get involved. I'm just curious to know like where this is going and if like people are talking about environmental justice and all of this.
Yeah. That's a good framework. It's not something that we're currently using, but I do think that we do need to move in that direction. You're right about environmental racism in Minnesota. I'll say from my perspective, one of the advantages that I have in terms of the Mexican Cultural Arts Alliance is that I'm able to compare what we do in Minnesota versus other parts of the country. And it's a challenge because on the one hand, Minnesota has the highest per capita spending on the arts, public dollar spending on the arts in the country. It's a lot easier for me than my friend in Indiana to raise money for the work that we're doing, or in Georgia, or even in Illinois, which is supposedly a blue state. And so there's real policies and real funding sources and political decisions that have and do benefit many communities of color in Minnesota. At the same time, Latinos have the lowest levels of funding from the state. So we have a weird contradiction where we have the highest per capita spending in the state and also the lowest. So we have to work through the contradictions, and we do need to recognize the ways in which there is the kind of Minnesota hypocrisy in a lot of the progressive policies. Yeah. ¿Qué pasa?
Are you also planning to take this to the legislation?
Great question. So a little history with or very short history with the policy work. So I do want to say that Minnesota Council of Latino Affairs has been incredibly supportive of our work. Rosa Toc, who is Guatemalteca, and Katia Cepeda, Mexicana, at MCLA have supported our work for a while. They were the ones that helped us do the Day of the Dead altar at the state capitol. And back when we had no money and no resources, we said we wanted to do this museum project, and they helped us facilitate conversations with policymakers around our project. We of course have an amazing champion, Maria Isa Perez Vega, who's Puerto Rican and representative since 2022. And she's of course an artist as well. To be honest, there's a lot of Latinos in positions of authority who don't understand the arts and who say they want arts, but then they don't really know how to work with artists. La verdad. But so it's great to have somebody who's not just from the community, born on the West Side, Latina, but also a working artist, and so she understands what we need and what we want. And so she's been advocating very strongly. This session, what happened was we put forward a $10 million capital campaign construction project budget with the state. That would not cover all the expenses for the museum, but it would be a lot, actually. It would be about half of our capital campaign. Usually what happens is it gets reduced in the negotiation process. But at the very end of the session, so the session started in February and then it ended in May, we were still in what's called the infrastructure bill. So we don't, the senators and representatives don't vote on Minnesota Latino Museum. They just vote on big infrastructure for like construction at the university, highways, parques, todo. It's one big package. And so the challenge is that we have to make sure that the museum stays within the package because things get reduced over time, right? So we do need very good political representation to make that happen. So we were part of the final package, not the full 10 million, but I think it was 6.2 million, which was still really significant. The whole infrastructure package failed. And so there was no new funding for construction anywhere in the state of Minnesota, highways, roads, whatever. I don't think that's a big problem for several reasons. One, last year, a lot of you know that there was a huge state surplus, and so they did a giant infrastructure package, and so there was just less political pressure to pass one this time around. Two, there's a state law or state policy guidelines that says that once you get the state funding, you have to open within 4 years. As the director, I was like, I don't know what this is like. So yo estaba contento de que no pasó. I was like, let's have to take that on recording. Well, it was a blessing and a curse, let's put it that way. So we have at least an additional year, right, to ramp up. We have to develop our organization. We have to do a lot of internal. I mean, ustedes saben, you guys do community work. There's a lot of work that has to go into making this stuff happen. So next year we're going to go back in. We feel very confident. We're in it for the long run. So si no pasa nada, no pasa nada. So when I agreed to do this, I was talking at the dinner table. Me preguntaron, like, how did you decide to do this? And for me, it was a calculation of A, can I do this? B, do I want to do this? And C, and this is very important, I've seen so many arts organizations, community organizations, even universities, make giant buildings, whatever, 10 años pasan y se les olvida, right? And so for me, the building is just a step in a long trajectory. Lo que estaban diciendo, we need activities all over the state, es muchísimo trabajo. So for me, it was like, can I dedicate the rest of my career to doing this? So tengo 42 años, I was like, I need to dedicate 30 years to this. And so for me, this is retirement plan. It's true, I made that decision. Entonces, so yes, so it's a long run, but we're in a very good place, and I appreciate the petition signatures. Gracias.
So my question is, I have a family member that's a Latina artist, and I want to ask a question from her. Is once you guys do build this museum, like, how do you guys get to pick and choose, or do you know, like, if she wants to work with you guys?
She should get involved right now.
What was that?
Right now, ahora. We do art activities right now. There's no reason to wait for the museum.
Do you have like a business card?
Te doy mi correo. She should follow us on Instagram, mn.latino.museum. Nos pueden mandar un mensaje por allá. Te doy mi celular sin problema. I would love to work with Latino artists all over the state, so that's not a question. In terms of who we select in the future, we have to develop those internal processes. We have to put committees together. So hay un proceso que se tiene que hacer, but we're not there yet.
I asked because when she was in college, she went to college for art, and she had so many awards, and then now that she's in the real world, it's really hard to succeed as a Latino artist.
That was my experience. I was an A student, I graduated, I couldn't make a living as an artist. Y la verdad, and that's why I started doing this. There was no, it was true. And so I understand that completely.
Okay, so I just want to say this is awesome. So congratulations
Gracias.
on doing this. So how can we bring more awareness? Do you guys have like social media? Like how can we have like your events that are coming up that we can promote it and, you know, really bring awareness to what you're doing?
Thank you. Sign the petition, you'll get on the email listserv. To be honest, we have one staff, soy yo. And actually I was on staff for about 2 years, and then I was, and it was complicated. So Instagram, we have a really good Instagram page. We don't do Facebook. Ahorita no. Instagram, WhatsApp, or email. I saw some hands over here. I didn't see where it was coming from. I use Facebook.
Yeah.
We just got that debate on the last board meeting. Sí, es cierto. Yes, who was going to ask? Hi.
I don't really know much about like, I guess Latino like culture,
Yeah.
especially like in Minneapolis. So I'm wondering if there are like community centers that are specifically dedicated, and if not, if you were thinking about somehow integrating that with the museum, so like there would be some level of consistency with people being in the building and like associating the building with their community or something.
Yes, so there are several Latino community centers in Minnesota. Clues has a headquarters in St. Paul, has a building in Minneapolis. Copal has a building in Minneapolis. We're doing a new building in Minneapolis. I'm sure some of the community organizations here have Greater Minnesota representation. We do work with Latino nonprofits. However, as somebody who was a director at or art director at a Latino nonprofit, there's a lot of challenges to doing that. Namely that there's certain things that you can't, or are harder to show. So for example, when I worked at Clues, there was some departments that focused on addiction. And so, and then other departments that focused on like sexual trauma. And so there were certain images that were, that are triggering to the people who participate in those activities, in those committees. And so it becomes a bit challenging to, the kind of art that you can show is narrowed in a non-art space than in an art space. And so we do collaborations with Latino nonprofits, social service organizations, and community centers. But we do think we need a sort of a separate building that is art specific.
Oh, okay, I have a follow-up question. So I'm also like the child of immigrants, so like I'm sure there's some level of overlap when it comes to like bringing cultures from one generation to the next. And so like I guess more of my question is like especially when it comes to childcare, that tends to be a really huge issue.
Yes.
Most immigrant families are much larger than like American families, and then there's the issue of being able to pay for childcare.
Yes.
So like I guess this is more of an idea than a question, just like somehow integrating children being able to come to the center and receive some sort of like caretaking, which would then like if a child grows up in that area, it would continue to like foster that like continuous community when it comes to like the art center or the building or something. I guess
Where are your parents from?
Liberia.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yes, you're right. I don't know what else to say. How are we doing on time?
I think we're fine. I mean, as long as people have questions, it's
¿Qué más?
almost 8:30, so.
I was going to dance rock and roll for you guys. So, search for Augie Garcia on YouTube. Search for the interview with Lila Downs in Minnesota, or Alan Downs project about her father. Search for, what was the other one? The interview with Luis Pech about the state flag. There's an interview in Spanish that you should, if you speak Spanish, you should watch. He's also done interviews in English as well. ¿Qué más? Ya se están durmiendo. Viene la hora de la chela. Hi.
I'm curious, like, So like this arts museum, is it just like the visual arts, or are you thinking about like the performing arts or like other forms? Just because I think of like, I'm going back to environmental justice. I'm an environmental studies major, so that's not but like, for example, like one of the ways that they have taught like environmental like education is through theater. So like this idea actually started in Brazil, and they would use like interactive theater arts to teach people like empowerment and engagement on like how to like speak to people in positions of power when they're feeling unsafe. But it's been like taught to children who are like bilingual or like integrating within like this like environmentally unjust neighborhood. There's like a lot of different stuff going on, but like I always thought like theater was like really cool, and it went with like making like murals, like these programs always did. And so I'm curious if like there are other art forms that are included besides the visual arts.
Yes, and I actually wasn't able to show music today, but yes, that is part of the plan. I will say, and I know there's always this question about why don't you do this, why don't you do this? All the ideas make sense, all the ideas are great. Also in my head, I was thinking I'm the art director as well, executive director of the organization. When I showed the plans of the museum to one of my mentors and the founder of the National Museum of Mexican Art, he called me and he was like, do you know how much money we spend on toilet paper every month? And so all this stuff costs a lot of money, like it really does. And so yes to all of this, but we also have to be strategic about, making sure that we actually do the stuff that we're going to say we're going to do and then kind of ramp up, but yes. ¿Qué más? ¿Ya? ¿Cómo estamos? ¿Ya? All right.
There will be a mural tour co-led by Aaron and Gustavo Lira, who's a fantastic mural artist. It's sort of a treasure in Minnesota, on Lake Street between 3 and 5 p.m. roughly. There'll be some logistical challenges because of construction on Lake Street. If anyone wants to get a copy of the mural itinerary, you can talk to Pedro. There's people coordinating a flotilla of vehicles, as I understand, from this area. I'll be in Minneapolis with Aaron and Gustavo.